of interest. Okay, so as Dennis mentioned, I've been at this for now a little more than 30 years, almost 35. And our partners, we don't do this work on our own thing. We don't just go out and do a study and publish a paper. That's not really useful to us or to the human rights community. We're not academics. So our goal is to support our partners' arguments. Our goal is to make their arguments unimpeachable on technical grounds. Our partners face immense political pressure and political critique. And I'll tell you a little bit about that and why we are so obsessed by getting calculations that we can defend in the most adversarial contexts. Because when we go back to the old human rights cliche of speaking truth to power, the trick there is that you have to speak the truth. That's something we sometimes neglect in that story. You know, we think of it as a phrase valorizing courage, but it's also valorizing technical rigor. You also have to get the numbers right if you're going to make a claim. And let me emphasize why I think this is so important. And in the context of these partners, first of all, these partners include 10 Truth Commissions, 9 human rights trials, including 3 former heads of state, UN missions in Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia, some governmental offices in places like Sierra Leone and Colombia and Guatemala, as well as dozens and dozens of non-governmental organizations, both local groups that are just collectives of family members who need a secure way to record their family's losses, to huge international NGOs like Human Rights Watch or Amnesty International. What brings all of those groups together is that they're doing something that will create someone who's armed, well-resourced, and hates them. And as a consequence of that, you have to think really hard about what is the responsibility that you're taking on by offering folks a kind of argument that they may not themselves fully understand. Because statistics are subtle and they're complex and they're almost always wrong, as I'm sure folks know, right? And so our trick is to figure out how wrong are they likely to be. So let's think about variance, let's think about unmeasured error, and think about those things in a way such that the argument we make is robust within the context of that variance and that unmeasured error. Because if we don't, we're not doing anybody a service. If we fail to provide a rigorous technical foundation to our partners, and their argument is discredited on technical grounds, we've harmed them. And that is something that my colleagues and I take immensely seriously. That the risks that our partners run to do this work are immense. Reputational risks, economic risks, political risks, and even physical risks. What can we do to reduce at least their technical exposure? What can we do to put their arguments on the soundest possible footing? Because the other side's going to push back. And I have some photos of some of the war criminals who push back on us. I always have to clarify, this is the one I mean here. We never tried that guy. But this guy, Hassan Habre, the former president of Chad, I was able to be an expert witness in his trial, and of course Milosevic. I won't talk about those cases very much, but if there's questions in the Q&A, I'm happy to talk about Chad and about the former Yugoslavia. The trick is that people in institutions that commit mass violence nearly always lie about it. And they have an army of apologists who also lie about it. Now, these lies are grotesque and easily disproven, but you got to do it. Okay? Folks who say don't feed the trolls, well, it turns out to be wrong. You have to stand up and rebut those arguments clearly and on a solid factual and analytic basis. Human rights campaigns can be successful. We can occasionally try some of the world's worst human rights abusers and hold them criminally responsible. In other contexts, we can hold groups morally responsible or individuals morally responsible. And I'll give a couple of examples of that in my talk. But the reason we're successful is because we're persistent and we speak with the moral authority of the victims. Well, we have to take that really seriously. And I'm going to keep coming back to that because I will say doing bad statistics in this space is much worse than doing no statistics. Bad statistics make everybody vulnerable, and they create to the cloud of cynicism and noise that allows perpetrators to say, well, nobody knows anything. It's all lost in the fog of war, which every trial I've ever been in, the defense says. You can't possibly know this. It's lost in the fog of war. So our job is to figure out how to unpack that, how to rebut it. Let me be clear. I've been working in human rights for 30-something years now, and I do not think that statistics is the most important part of human rights. It might be the least important part of human rights. In fact, my colleagues and I always say our fondest dream is to be a footnote, but we want to be a really good footnote. And we say it sort of as a joke, but not really. I mean, really what needs to be up front is the experiences of the people who suffered. So why is this hard? Why is it even a big deal? Well, the trick is that we usually don't know what we don't know. Okay? We often are in a situation, we have a bunch of data, but the data was not collected by a probability sample. That's vanishingly rare. I know of 2 or 3 or 4 in the course of my career, maybe 6. But like, I'm getting old, some of them slip away, but not very many. Okay? Out of the hundreds and hundreds of projects I've been in, there's a tiny number. And the problem is that what we don't know is generally systematically different from what we do know. Okay? Because the way we got the data was some social mechanism which created visibility, which made it possible to get that data. In our team, we have a saying that I try to teach all the junior folks who come in, which is that when a lawyer is killed at high noon in the city square, the whole world knows before dinner time. But when a peasant is killed in the dead of night, 3 days walk from a road, we're never going to hear about it. That's going to go completely undocumented. And often in the last 10 or even 15 years, people have rebutted and said, well, listen, technology's changed everything. No, it's changed nothing. In fact, it's made it worse. And it's made it worse. Technology and the ubiquitous use of cell phones has made things much, much worse, because that lawyer that was killed in a city square, yeah, where we used to get 10 reports, now we get 1,000. Okay, we have 1,000 reports, and 500 of them have video from all around it. Great. The peasant killed out in the countryside, we still hear nothing. When I worked in the Congo in 2009, I was working for the UN mission there, and at that time, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton came to Eastern Congo and was touring and said, hey, and she heard, that the militias would show up at a village and would do terrible things, and the UN peacekeepers wouldn't get there for 3 or 4 days. Okay? And her sense was, well, we just don't have enough information to react quickly enough. So the UN, at enormous cost, subsidized 2 South African cell phone companies to build cell phone towers all across Eastern Congo. And for those of you who've been there, I imagine your experience is you have better cell phone connectivity in Eastern Congo than you do in the Santa Cruz Mountains. Okay? Nothing has changed in terms of reporting on militia attacks. Why is that? And I think that this department is especially well positioned to understand this problem. We have this conjuncture of a social problem and a technical problem. The technical problem is that it's hard to flow information from remote areas, but we can solve that problem, and we often devote a lot of energy to it through Starlink or all sorts of other nifty tools now. The social problem is that rural people around the world generally think that nothing good is ever coming to their community from outside. This is one of the few sort of human universals I've found everywhere. Nothing good is coming to us from outside. They're probably not wrong. Which means you don't reach to outside for help when something terrible happens. Okay, why am I going into such depth in this example? The data are terrible. When we are looking at data on mass violence, you have to assume that in your best case in a well-registered and highly literate society, you're going to get half or 2/3 of the data. And the data you didn't get, again, is going to be systematically different than the data you did get. So if you do analysis on the data you have, you're going to be wrong. And if you'll recall, just one slide ago, I made a whole song and dance about how that's very, very costly. We can't afford to be wrong. So let me tell you a little story from an example. And let's say we collect and organize 3 databases. Okay? We collected one, and then maybe the Catholic Church did one, and I'm thinking of a particular case here. And then some left-wing NGOs did a 3rd one. And we, through a variety of elaborate negotiations, we've gotten all 3 of them together, and we've done a record linkage exercise, so we know which cases are in common. This is not easy, but it's fun, and it's technically super interesting in Q&A. If people want to go down and talk about record linkage for the next 4 days, I'd be delighted. So we've done record linkage, so we know the intersections between all the data sets, but we're stuck in the white circles. We don't know what's outside. We don't know how to make an inference for the population, right? We just don't know. Are we living in the world on the left or on the world on the right? Do we know 1/3 of the data, or do we know almost all of it? And the problem is that if we split the data up, say by perpetrator in Peru, we know 1/3 of the data about Sendero Luminoso and almost all the data on people killed by the army. but it's the same size of data sets. So if we just stay with where we are, if we just use the data we have, if we just let the data speak, which I hope none of you have ever uttered, we're making an egregiously naive mistake, okay? Which is the mistake is we're assuming equal sampling across the two different perpetrators, which is not true at all in this context. Why does it matter? Well, this was an analysis that I did for the Peruvian Truth Commission in 2003, and the key question, the key moral question that the Truth Commission had to address was, what are the relative proportions of responsibility in this conflict between the Maoist guerrillas of Sendero Luminoso and the army? And if we had just stayed with the data, we'd be stuck, because almost all of the analyses up until 2003 had said, well, the army has committed many more violations. Well, why is that? Social visibility. The people being killed by the army were largely in the lowlands and in big cities, and some in the highlands, but the people being killed by Sendero Luminoso were almost exclusively in the highlands. When we presented our estimates to people in Lima, intellectuals in Lima, they're like, this can't possibly be true. Everyone I know has been killed by the army. You see the problem. Sendero Luminoso didn't have that kind of capability. They weren't killing that many people in Lima. So I'm going to bang on this drum a little more, but then I'll be done. This is my last slide of drum banging, maybe second to last. When I looked at data coming out of Iraq, I got really, really nervous. Starting in 2004, 2005, I got really, really nervous about the data coming from Iraq. There's a terrific project, the Iraq Body Count, that organized media coverage of homicides across Iraq, starting in 2003. And they organized hundreds of sources from all over the world, basically every significant news source from all over the world in dozens of languages. They translated these things and they extracted references to homicides day upon day. And then they did analysis with it. And I said, there's something wrong. Not all the homicides are there. And they said, sure, we know they're not all there, but enough are there that we can get a reasonable analysis. And I said, no, that's not how that works. It's not how that works, because the ones you don't have are really different than the ones you do have. And they're like, nonsense. Academic gunfight ensues. After years, they gave me the data for the Februaries. I'm not sure how that was chosen, but for 4 years. We put the data together and I said, look, I want to look at coverage density. So I separated the events into 4 groups by the size of the event. Groups of 15 or more victims, these are all deaths. 6 to 14 victims, 2 to 5 victims, and 1 victim. Okay? And then I measured the number of sources per event in each of those 4 categories. And we see that for very large events of 15 or more victims, more than 3/4 of all those events have 15 or more sources. Okay? When there's a big event, all the world's media shows up. Okay? But if we move over here to say events of 1 victim, we see that 3/4 have only 1 or 2 sources. Now, the fundamental question we're asking here rendered in the context of this particular example is, how many events are there with 0 sources? Okay. So this is a technically skilled crowd. Are the events with 0 sources more likely to be events of 1 victim or 15 or more victims? Who votes for 1? I won't even ask the other one. So if you do a little back of the envelope with species richness models, those of you who know how species richness models are a way of using multiple documentations of particular events or species to estimate the totals, you'll get a difference in the probability of reporting of about a factor of 5 between small events and large events. Okay, that's a big deal. There's an enormous data bias between large events and small events in Iraq. Why does it matter? It matters because there were actually 2 different conflicts going on at the same time, completely different conflicts. The small events were perpetrated largely by Shia militias, largely against Sunni people, and not just Sunni people, but Sunni adult men, this is key, committed with firearms with the goal of ethnic cleansing. These were people being driven out of Baghdad and its suburbs to I don't think the militias cared, but they were being driven into the western part of Iraq. The large events were largely Al-Qaeda in Iraq and other international groups, as well as some coalition collateral damage events. They were either IEDs or airstrikes or massacres. They were a random selection of the Iraqi population, Sunni, Shia, in some cases Kurd, men, women, old, young. And the goal was to stabilize and control. If you only look at the press data, this is all you see. And if you think about it for a minute, it becomes really clear why that's true. One of the reasons was, who did the press care about? The press cared about the international conflict. America has invaded Iraq. Okay, what is America? Why did America Iraq? Well, the Bush administration told us we were going after terrorists. Quickly, a quick pivot after the no weapons of mass destruction. Okay, no, we're going to go after terrorists. And there were, in fact, terrorists who were attacking U.S. Forces, but even more so attacking the Iraqi civilian population. So there was plenty to cover. When there's one of these very large events, the coalition forces would surround the event, they would secure the space, and enable international journalists to cover it. When one guy got killed in the middle of the night in a back alley, nobody ever saw it. It just disappeared. Maybe that guy would turn up in a morgue report later. Often enough, not at all. So when we looked to statistical analysis of violence in Iraq, all we got was the right side. You may recall that shortly after this data stopped being collected, there was a big problem in Western Iraq, right? The Islamic State entered Western Iraq and they were warmly welcomed. Why were they warmly welcomed? Because those were people who had been driven out of the Baghdad suburbs and needed security. And the Islamic State offered them security, and so they accepted it and they welcomed it. That's not the way we told the story in the world. Now, I'm not going to say that bad data analysis is why the world fundamentally misunderstood the threat of the Islamic State. That's a little strong. What I will say, though, is that we looked at quantitative analysis to correct our qualitative biases. We think, because often enough in graduate school we get caught in pointless arguments between qualitative and quantitative, we think that somehow the quantitative will balance the qualitative. Not at all. In fact, a problem occurs that in my team we call anti-learning. You anti-learn when you use a very poor data set that you fail to correct for its biases to confirm a prejudice you started the project with. Now you have confirmed your prejudice in the wrong conclusion. You have anti-learned. And that is the risk of naive use of weak data, which, again, all the data in my field is weak. So what are we going to do? We got to do population estimation, right? You've got to figure out some kind of probability model that's going to enable some mechanism to make a population estimation that gets you outside of the limitations of your sample. Now, there's a stack of assumptions that goes from here to Newark. We can talk about that in the Q&A if people would like. I'm not going to go too far into this example. I'll just leave it up there. I think this is, if you haven't seen this method in your graduate studies, please go look up multiple systems estimation. Demographers have done the most important work on this stuff. It is, as far as I know, pretty much our only way out of convenience data, out of simple non-probability lists to get to population level estimates. You don't do it with 2 systems, you do it with 3 or 20 or now 50 lists. It involves a lot of other machinery to get to this method, but there's a ton of really, really great new Bayesian methods. Again, I'm going to leave it to the Q&A. What I want you to have a sense of is that by collecting multiple data sets, we have the ability to make a population estimate that gets us out of all the biased stuff that I've just spent the last 20 minutes or so fretting over. Okay? And it doesn't get us all the way out, and we're still stuck with a bunch of assumptions. Welcome to science, right? I mean, that's how it is. And we have to work around those limitations and those weaknesses. So the first example that I'm going to present from our work is going to be police homicides in the United States. Here we're going to just work with two data sets, and that is the key problem that I'll be addressing here. Back in 2001, I think, way back in 2001, the US Congress asked the Department of Justice how many people are killed by police every year in the United States. And the Department of Justice said, oh. And you might think, how could it be that the Department of Justice doesn't know how many people are killed in the United States? May I remind you, we're a federal system. There is no obligation from the 18,000 separate police jurisdictions in the United States to report officer-involved deaths to the federal government. In several states, including California, Texas, and Connecticut, among several others, but it's only about 6 or 7, local jurisdictions have an obligation to report to the state, but that's a state law situation. There's no, even the states, and famously Texas, does not send the data to Washington, to the Bureau of Justice Statistics. So when BJS publishes stuff, they don't know. So Congress is like, do something. And so BJS said, great, we'll do a press database. I kid you not. This is what the Bureau of Justice Statistics has to do to get police killings in the United States. They have to create a press database. So we ended up with 2 databases. One is called the Supplemental Homicide Report, and that's a report that the FBI publishes on the homicides that are reported to the federal government. So they do end up somewhere. The FBI organizes them as an adjunct to what used to be called the Uniform Crime Report and is now called the National BIRS. I don't remember the rest of those letters. Sorry. And the Supplemental Homicide Report is a list of people killed by police in the preceding year. And then the Arrest-Related Deaths database is the database that the Bureau of Justice Statistics developed based on press reporting. They handed these two databases over to Research Triangle Incorporated in Chapel Hill, or in Durham, can't remember, in North Carolina. They did a study using the method that I described before, a two-system method which has a bunch of problems, and they made an estimate of about 7,500 deaths in a weird period, 2003 to 9 and 11. Somehow they skipped 2010. So here we are. And my colleague, Christian Lohmann, I looked at that and said, that's too low. And it's too low because one of the key assumptions in this method is that the data sets you use must be independent. And independence in this context specifically means that the probability of observation of a death in the population by one of those projects must be uncorrelated with the probability of observation in the other system. Yeah, that's not how it works, okay? Everything's correlated, and they're correlated because of this whole problem of social visibility I talked about. The thing that's creating visibility is creating visibility for both projects, and something that suppresses visibility suppresses also for both of these projects. And in the US context, when people say, well, we know about all kinds of homicides, gosh, we learned about, George Floyd, we learned about all these different cases, we get all this media. Sure. How many undocumented immigrants do you know have been killed by police? Oh, not so many, right? Why? Oh, because their family can't afford to report it. They can't afford to take the heat from the police because they are at risk of deportation. So you have to think about who's at risk for reporting, and that will tell you something about these structures of visibility, okay? The structures of bias. So we looked at this and we said there's a correlation. So what can we do about the correlation? Well, we've been using this method for years, and we've been using this method for years with log linear estimation methods. Okay, there's a way you can do this using simple log linear modeling of the contingency table, which I'll show you in a couple minutes, of whether a particular case is in or not in a series of databases. Okay, so you can use that log linear model. This is how it was done in the frequentist days. Are we still in those days or not? Are we? Okay. No, not. Anyway. And we can then estimate those inter-system correlations. And so we looked at data sets that we had and estimates we'd made from Kosovo, Colombia, Guatemala, Sierra Leone, and Syria. Sierra Leone never saw the light of day, by the way, for good reasons, I think. But in particular, we chose the estimates from Colombia. And the little box plot there shows the range of correlations among systems. And we decided to use the estimated correlations from Colombia to adjust the US data. And the reason is that in Colombia, similar to the US, we had both police-reported databases and press databases, which we did not have police-reported databases in the other countries. So we used the Colombian estimates, and that allowed us to make an estimate of the total. And so if we use those estimates, we get an estimate of the total. And with the total, and then adjusting for a couple of other pieces, because we don't have all jurisdictions, so not all jurisdictions are actually in scope here, and a couple of the pieces, we came up with an estimate of about 1,500 deaths per year in the period 2003, 9, and 11, excluding 2010. 1,500 deaths per year. Sorry.
So did you have additional information? What allowed you to estimate this dependence directly in Colombia, but you can't do that?
We had more than two systems. If you have more than two data sets, then you can calculate the correlations among the data sets. Okay. If you have only two, you're stuck with the simple algebra. But you can actually do a full model and model the pairwise coefficients in addition to the individual coefficients if you have more than three or more. And in those places, we had 3, 4, or 5. This is before the sort of explosion of data, which now we end up with 20 or 30, and it creates a different set of better problems. Right? They're better problems. And so at 1,500 deaths a year, police deaths a year, let's kind of put that in context, right? So there's plus minus 15 to 17,000 homicides in the US per year. Right? So we're looking at, 8 to 10% of homicides in the US are caused by police. Of all homicides in the United States, approximately 3/4 are among people who know each other before the event. Okay? They're acquaintances. They may be business associates, they may be family members, they may be intimate partners, they may be gang rivals. They know each other. Of the remaining quarter, a third are committed by police. So if you spend time in your life worrying about mass shooters, if you worry about terrorist attacks, if you worry about gangbangers killing people, killing bystanders, may I suggest to you that the larger threat, by about a factor of 3 to 5, is police. Police, if you were killed by a stranger in the United States, the single most likely category of stranger to kill you is a police officer. So useful to recall. So we've written a bunch of stories about that and blah, 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 blah.
Can I
Sure.
ask about Colombia? So you say the reason you're using it is because the data is similar.
Mhm.
But isn't that ignoring what you said at the beginning, which is that it's all about the social mechanism? And you're asking, is Colombia like the United States? I would say, I don't think so. Even though the data may look similar, they're very different places. The press is different. The federalism is different. The reporting is different. Everything's different.
Everything's different, but less different than all the other ways we have it, than all the other mechanisms we have. So if we say in the US, we have press reported data and police reported data, okay, where else do we have police reported data? Not very many other places. Philippines is the only other place I know where we have police reported data from the actual police department. It's subject to all sorts of visibility limitations, for sure. And in particular, but what's interesting in Colombia is most of the killing is not done by the police. Most of the killing is done by the army and the paramilitary groups, and then secondarily the guerrillas. And then way down the list, are the police. So the police have less invested than they do in the US. So there's a little, that's the major difference, I think, between, and the federalism problem too, but I think the major difference has to do with who are the police reporting the killings about. The press, though, I don't know that they're all that different, honestly, between Colombia and the US, in terms of what is visible to them and what they report. For example, if we were talking about it now, I'd say the most likely killings to go unreported in Colombia are among Venezuelan refugees because they have a similar precarious legal position to undocumented immigrants in the United States. And there is massive, massive amounts of homicide among the Venezuelan migrants in Colombia right now. Just spectacular, which is completely understandable if one thinks about the resource struggle that those folks are engaged in.
Should we let you finish, or should I keep asking?
You can, but I mean, what time is it?
Oh,
I think
it's you have 10 to 15.
Oh gosh, okay, well, no.
Okay.
Then, all right, then I'm gonna ask people, would you rather I talk about Colombia or Guatemala? Because I only got time for one. Colombia. Colombia is a data set that you could use if you're a graduate student. So we're gonna sell a big data set. Okay, Guatemala. Guatemala's got the added benefit that it's about genocide. Okay, Guatemala wins. Okay, so we're gonna talk about another war criminal. Again, not that one, this guy. Yeah, I mean, to junior students, do you guys even know who that guy is? All right, sorry, Grandpa Patrick moment. Anyway, Efrain Rios Montt took power in a coup. He was a senior military leader, and there was a junior officer coup in March of 1982 in Guatemala. The junior officers were politically unstable amongst themselves, so they chose a senior officer to lead the coup. That turned out to be a man that they were all kind of afraid of, who was an evangelical, a very outspoken evangelical Christian and extreme proponent of prosecuting the war against the leftist guerrillas in the most violent way possible. They chose him. He became the de facto president of Guatemala. He ruled until August 1983, when he was then deposed in a coup. He received enormous political support from the United States. The evangelical community, and I keep harping on evangelical because this was the key reason he got enormous support from the United States. In fact, then evangelical leader Jerry Falwell traveled to Guatemala and led his television show from Guatemala City repeatedly. And this was really important because it pressured the Republican Party in the United States, who then was just building a relationship with the evangelicals, to support Guatemala very, very strongly. As a consequence, Guatemala did not lack for political support, but the US was prohibited from a Carter administration era law in 1978 from direct military assistance to Guatemala. The military and intelligence assistance flowed through Israel and came from Israel to Guatemala, and Israeli advisors played the role that US advisors so often play in counterinsurgency. Indigenous communities in Guatemala, of which there are 24 or 27, depending on how you count. Different anthropologists have different theories, but 20-something anyway. Many different indigenous communities, many of them alleged in real time that genocide was being committed against their communities. There were a number of human rights monitors from around the world who said as much as well. The world ignored this. However, the indigenous communities and their organizations did not forget. And over the decades, they pressured the Guatemalan government to bring General Rios to trial. That did not happen until 2010. The trial didn't happen until 2013, but the organizing began in 2010. The trial was in 2013. I'm going to cut to the chase, which is the analysis that my colleagues and I did, is that we estimated in one specific community, the community of the Ixil people, one of the indigenous communities of Guatemala, in 3 specific counties or municipios, Chajul, Cotzal, and Nevac. In those 3 counties, around 2,147 people from a population of 38,900 were killed. Okay, so there's a 5.5% crude mortality rate due to homicide by the army. Okay, in that period, in this brief period from 82 to 83. Their neighbors, non-indigenous people, 41 were killed out of a population of 5882, okay, for 0.7%. Now, let me suggest to you that as demographers, one of the ways, and statisticians, one of the ways we should understand the notion of genocide is as a differential mortality rate. Okay? The Genocide Convention specifies that genocide is not simply the act of mass killing. Genocide is the act of the attempt to eliminate a group, killing being one of several mechanisms for elimination that are listed and have been established through subsequent jurisprudence in the various trials that we've had around genocide. But you're trying to eliminate a specific group. So if you kill everyone in a region, that's mass killing, that's not genocide. But if you kill everyone of one ethnicity or one religion, and you exclude their neighbors, okay, now you're talking that is looking like it could be genocide. So you want to look for these differential killing rates if you're thinking about it in a multi-ethnic community. So we compare those, we get a difference of around a factor of 8. Okay? So that we can interpret that for lawyers, saying that if you lived in this community, if you lived in one of these 3 counties in the period of Rios Mont's government, your probability of being killed by the army was about 8 times greater if you're indigenous relative to being non-indigenous. Okay? And that is the summary of what was about 4 years' work. Because we had to come up with all the data. So the data we organize looking like this. When I mentioned that there's a contingency table, this is what I mean. So we can say that on the bottom row, there were only 18 deaths across all periods and only 2 in the period of interest that are in the left-wing NGOs, the Catholic Church, the Truth Commission, and the subsequent Program for National Compensation. These are 4 giant projects that interviewed thousands and thousands of people. We got access to their data. We extracted all the homicide reports from that. We did record linkage across all 4 sets, and then established that only 2 deaths in the relevant period are in all 4 data sets. The interesting question is, how many deaths are there that are not in any of the 4 data sets? So that's what we're trying to estimate. Okay, and that's what we use multiple systems estimation for, or capture recapture is another language, that's another phrase that's used for it. And so with this contingency table, you can just stay there and just fit a log linear model to it, where you're predicting the column of deaths, and then your intercept value, exponentiated because it is log linear, is your estimate. Yay, done. Yeah, we can talk about, we can get into technical details in Q&A if people would like. What was most interesting for a Bay Area audience, I think, is to say that we knew there was a census in 1981, but that census had just essentially disappeared from Guatemala. And it disappeared for complicated reasons, but one of the reasons is, why did we do a census on the eve of genocide? The census was wrapped up in December 1981. The genocide started in March 82. Whoa, I wonder if anybody in here is a fan of Bill Seltzer and Margo Anderson. There's some scary things that happen with our field, all right? And demography, this is not the first time demographers have been used to set up a genocide that comes later. Censuses are very, very dangerous tools in the hands of people who want to commit mass violence, and in Guatemala, for sure. So one of the only extant copies of that census is at Stanford. So I was working in Palo Alto at the time. I went over to Stanford. I got copies of the relevant pages, and that's how I know the underlying populations of indigenous and non-indigenous people. In fact, my phrasing, indigenous and non-indigenous, comes from the census of 1981. Now we use other language in Guatemala. Although this is not considered offensive in Guatemala, it is not the way people talk about it anymore. So it all boils down to this problem, right? This problem of relative risk. And I will leave it there because I want to leave a tiny bit of time for questions. But and I will skip the Columbia example. Maybe I'll just leave up the one table that I think is I just really, really like that. That's the important. If you want to know about Columbia, that's your takeaway. Talk about it. So I'll leave that there. In any case, thanks very much for your time. And I'm sorry I went so slowly and ran out of the final example. I hope there's questions. You want to know what this graph is?
Well, that too, but I actually have another question.
Okay, go for it.
So at the very beginning, you talked about two kinds of responsibility, one being criminal and one being moral.
Mhm.
And I guess I just wanted to hear a little bit more about how you differentiate the two, because it's very obvious to me what criminal responsibility looks like. It's not so obvious to me what moral responsibility really means. So yeah, I just wanted to hear that.
So I'll take this to Guatemala because that's the example that I think I know best. If in Guatemala you talk to a person in Guatemala City, a taxi driver, a shopkeeper, a lawyer, and you said, "Hey, did the army commit genocide here? In the beginning of the 80s?" They'd be like, "What are you talking about? I mean, what is genocide?" If you asked that question in 2000 through 2005 or 6, they would have been like, "Oh yeah, the army totally committed genocide against the indigenous people." And now if you ask, you'll get it depends, you'll get a very kind of polarized answer about whether or not there was genocide. No, there wasn't genocide. The army saved us from communism. Yes, there was genocide. The army was attempting to repress the indigenous people's demand for their rights over their land and their labor. Okay, moral responsibility is an attempt to establish a pervasive sense of who done it. Okay, who is responsible for the violence? And it is, I think, the sort of fundamental goal of most human rights movements is to have an acknowledgement of who did all these terrible things and who suffered these terrible things. Because what apologists for violence always do is say, no, we're the victims, right? When Slobodan Milosevic is motivating the people who will become his paramilitary shock troops in his classic speech in 1989 in Kosovo, he says, "They will never beat you again." That is like the line that comes out of that. That's what everybody remembers. They weren't getting beaten in the first place. Nobody was getting beaten. But by saying, "They will never beat you again," he makes you into the victim, clouding this responsibility, right? Creating a sense that we have to act before they act against us. And so the reason that the human rights movement is so focused on this establishment of moral responsibility, I believe, is in order to prevent the apologists from flipping the story around and making the victims somehow to blame for the murder of their community, the annihilation of their community. So that's what I mean by moral responsibility. It is not a clear-cut thing, but it is a thing we're always trying to do.
So sometimes, but not always, this would overlap with criminal responsibility.
Correct.
And it might help.
Criminal responsibility is often one of the ways we try to get to moral responsibility, and it sometimes works and sometimes doesn't. This was a very intense argument that we had at the International Criminal Tribunal for former Yugoslavia when we were, one of the things people refer to as The Hague, although The Hague means like 27 different things. But when we say The Hague, one of the things it means is this tribunal that tried people who committed crimes against humanity, war crimes, and genocide in the former Yugoslavia. What responsibility did we have as the tribunal to help establish the truth about what happened? Now, the hardcore prosecutors and the cops were like, we have no responsibility. We just have to win the trials. We just have to convict these guys. They're guilty. We need to convict them. They need to do their sentences. People who were not completely embedded in a legal notion of justice, but rather had a somewhat larger verdict, they're just like, well, no, actually, we're just playing games here in the Netherlands if it's not reverberating back in Sarajevo, Belgrade, and Pristina. If we're not making an impact on how people understand responsibility in the former Yugoslavia, then this isn't all that useful. It's great to get the guys out of positions of power, but other than that, like, what's the point here? And I'm a Durkheim guy, right? So for me, the reason we do trials is to celebrate wrongness in order to reaffirm rightness. Like, that's why we do it, I think. And if nobody's listening, if there's no audience, it's pointless.
Sorry, I was just gonna ask a question. So you would theoretically you would prefer like more data sets that are, I wouldn't say mediocre, but like average compared to like a smaller number of very high quality data sets because you don't really know how represented they are. And so the more estimates you can get from data sets.
Yeah, prefer is such a strong word, right? It implies I have choices. I don't have any choices. You show up and the data sets are what they are. Maybe if you are enormously well resourced and you've got incredible partners and some sort of very generous donor behind you, you can create a data set or two on your own. But that's very hard and it's very time consuming and can be risky. I mean, risky in the sense that you could fail technically. So what happens here? I won't. Or you can fail politically, or you could get people hurt. I mean, you could get people testifying to you hurt, or you could get your people hurt. So you're generally stuck with the data sets that you can negotiate. Who's going to share their data with you? And so you got to have 3 data sets or more, or you can't play. I'll take whatever I can get, and I'll take as many as I can get. So there's no real preferring, unfortunately.
Thanks. To go back to some of the questions relating to moral and legal responsibilities, in Sierra Leone, there was a lot of international attention to the fact that a kind of amnesty had to be agreed upon in order for the parties to end the conflict. And among one of the sort of agreements that ended up really impacting data about atrocities. I mean, I remember that in one of the reports you co-authored, you take pains right at the very beginning to say the RUF are, the Revolutionary United Fronts are definitely responsible for the majority of atrocities.
Massive, overwhelming.
Massive. Okay, but
80+%.
there were tremendous civilian complaints about atrocities committed by the Nigerian troops of ECOMOG in retribution in Freetown, especially in January 1999. And there was a kind of agreement that no ECOMOG soldier would or officer would be put on trial at the special court. And also statistics were never produced. They never appeared as it were.
ECOMOG's one of the categories.
Okay, you did.
Yeah.
So there are ways that just didn't.
But the data, first of all, we had one data source. So it's subject to all of my complaints and concerns about bias.
Right.
I found the signal to be so strong that the RUF was overwhelmingly responsible, and I'm nonetheless confident. There's just no way you could come up with enough cases to make ECOMOG, for example, more than half of this. I think ECOMOG dominates our story because it was embedded in the way you described it, right? Where did ECOMOG commit those killings? In the capital. So where we saw them. Where did RUF commit their killings? Some in the capital in their 2 big incursions, but mostly out in the bush. So we didn't get them until the Truth Commission went out and did thousands of interviews with people in representative sampling of the counties, but it wasn't representative sampling of victims because there's no list, there's no frame for that sample. So we did sample geographically, we didn't sample. There were other technical problems. I'm curious that I'm getting political and philosophical questions in a demography. I was hoping for math, but okay.
So my math is not advanced. Can you talk a little bit more about this methodology? So if you have 3 or more data sets, you're getting, the way I think about it, is you're getting 3 different angles of view on the unknown. But what about, maybe you've said this, so I just need to be explained at a more simple level. But it seems to me that the unknown is the extent to which these data sets all share a blind spot.
Correct. That's one of several.
Okay, could you just sort of talk a little more about how to overcome that problem?
Well, I wish I had better answers, but I'm looking at someone here who has made many critiques of this method and on the in the Zoom call, so I'm looking forward to him weighing in as well, Ken. Okay, so, and I don't think we've talked about it for over 20 years, but one of the assumptions we have to make is that there is a non-zero, and it turns out substantial probability of documentation for every event that's in the universe by at least one system. Okay. And there's a really nice paper about this by James Jondro and Christian Lum and Daniel Manrique-Vallier that talks, and they talk about it in the context of, we may not know what that observability fraction is, below which we don't know, but if we just say we're only estimating the events that have a probability of observation greater than this, they call it alpha observability, greater than alpha, we can get a lower bound on the total, which is much more reliable than the one that we would estimate without specifying this floor of observability. And and we reduce the variance enormously. We get a much more precise estimate for this lower bound. What I have found is that statisticians who spend a long time studying this method end up often talking about lower bounds, because the method is always subject to the weakness that we are assuming that there is enough coverage, and we aren't even super clear about what that is, over the entire stratum that we're estimating that the method will work. When the method fails, and there's a paper that I think that Danielle, one of the scholars that works in this, as a statistician at Indiana University, Danielle Manrique-Vallier, Danielle gave a paper at the ASA a few weeks ago, and if I understand it correctly, and yeah, it's a hairy paper, but if I understand it correctly, one of the things he's saying is he's demonstrating the intuition that we've had for a while, which is that the method pretty much always, with some really weird exceptions, will estimate with a downward bias when it fails, because of this probability that we don't know what it is below which the method won't pick up substrate. Now, he works on it because the method, the way that this method has been since 1949, when one of the original papers was written, bringing it into demography by Deming and Chandrasekhar. This is a classic, amazing paper that folks should read. It's really 1949. They've always recommended that when we have differential probabilities of observation, different reporting rates in different segments of the population, you should stratify your sample and then estimate within each of those strata in an attempt to reduce the heterogeneity of capture probabilities or observation probabilities within strata so that you have variability among and not within. Okay? Standard stratification hack. Danielle's method, called latent class models for capture recapture, LCMCR, does this with partitioning. So it takes a given stratum, partitions it, and looks for the fit of an independence model in each of the strata that it estimates into. So it partitions things out. His claim is that his method, he can show, necessarily fails with a downward bias. His method is the one we generally use now. Not always, we sometimes use another Bayesian approach from Jerry Madigan and David York. Dave Madigan and Jeremy York, there we go. So I hope that gets you, but there are a couple other problems, but they're assumptions that we've long worried about in capture recapture. Most of those assumptions have been, I think, largely addressed or shown to not have as much impact as we worried about in the past. Record linkage, turns out this method is really robust, even when record linkage is kind of failure prone. There's a lot of errors in record linkage. Method turns out to be pretty good. Intersystem correlations, what we were worried about in terms of social visibility, all the modern methods handle that without too much trouble. The real ongoing problem is this notion of the heterogeneity of capture probabilities across a population, and you don't know what the dimensions of heterogeneity are. You can't separate them out. If you can separate them out, you can stratify, or latent class modeling will do it. But if you don't know, and they're hard to find, you won't get it. And then if there's a blind spot that everybody shares with near zero observation probabilities for some subpopulation that's embedded in the population you think you're estimating, you're not going to get it. And so your method will underestimate because you just miss those. So I'd say this is not a perfect method. It's probably as good as we've got with data sources like this. I think Andy Gelman would tell me I'm wrong and that we should do something, with some sort of multi-level regression and post-stratification hack, but I haven't figured out how that would work in this space. But if I were presenting at Columbia, I suspect he'd be roasting me for that.
So I'm curious about how you handle putting together these disparate data sets when the motivation for the violence is different. So I'm thinking about, for instance, like police violence or lynching as opposed to ethnic cleansing.
Why does it matter?
Well, in my case, like with lynching, the violence is intended to be visible as a means of social control. It's like a terroristic social control. And so I would think that that would mean the assumptions that you have about the data set would be different than ethnic cleansing where you're taking peasants and killing them in the night.
Or former Baptist officials and killing them in the night, but yes.
Sure.
For me, that's just a difference in the likely probability of observation. The intention of the killing doesn't really affect what I'm looking at. What does affect it is if the intention is, as you suggest, correlated with this probability of observation. Well, I'm interested in the probability of observation. That's actually something I'm going to estimate. So that's something I would observe. And if we think that, say, Monroe work today, which I imagine you're very familiar with, if you know that data set, they claim to be a complete data set of lynchings. Maybe they are. Maybe they're not. I don't know. I would start from the theory that it's probably pretty close because of what you say. But I suspect there are subcategories of lynching which were not well documented. And I wouldn't know what they were until I started getting in. But they'd have to be documented a little bit, as I just described, or we wouldn't be able to use this fact. And you'd need to have other data sets besides just the two or three, or the one really big one that I know of. There may be more. Specific, probably there are more for localities.
Great, okay. We're at time. Thank you very much. This was wonderful. Please join me in thanking. And for those who are interested, we're